She was 31 years old. She had a daughter who was 7, a husband who worked the early shift at the paper mill, and a small white house on the edge of a town where almost everyone knew almost everyone else. On the morning of September 14th, 1968, she walked out to her garden to cut the last of the summer roses, and she was never seen alive again. That is not a story about a woman who ran away. That is not a story about a stranger passing through. That is a story about someone who already knew where she kept her garden shears, who already knew what time her husband left, and who lived close enough to watch. And it would take 40 years, one cold case detective who refused to retire, and a backhoe digging 40 inches into the earth of a property, sold 3 times over to give Dorothy Harlan the justice she had been owed since the last warm September of the 1960s. But before we get to any of that, we have to go back to Keswick, Maine, in the summer before all of it happened. Because to understand what was taken, you first have to understand who Dorothy Harlan was. Keswick, Maine, in 1968, was the kind of place that existed at the exact boundary between small and smaller still. The town sat in the broad shadow of the Kennebec Valley, population just under 2,000. The kind of community where the single hardware store on Route 9 also sold bait and occasionally cashed personal checks for people the owner had known since grade school. By September, the maples had already begun to turn along the back roads. The mornings carried a cold edge even when the afternoons held on to what remained of summer, and the smell of wood smoke had drifted back into the air for the season. People left their side doors unlocked. Children rode their bikes until the streetlights came on. The local diner, Evelyn's on Bridge Street, had the same pie rotating, in the same case it had carried since 1951, and nobody seemed to mind that. Dorothy Harlan had grown up 40 miles east in a smaller town still, and had come to Keswick at 23 when she married Gerald Harlan, a quiet, steady man who operated machinery at the Penobscot Valley Paper Company, and had a dry sense of humor and the kind of reliability that people in that era understood as a form of love. They had their daughter, Carol Ann, in 1961. By 1968, Dorothy had built herself a life inside that house on Alderman Road that was modest and genuine and fully hers. She kept a kitchen garden behind the house, vegetables through July, then dahlias and snapdragons, and in September, the last roses of the season, which she would cut and place in a mason jar on the kitchen table every week until the frost took them. Neighbors remembered her for her cooking, for the regularity of her wave from the front porch, for the way she remembered the names of their children. Her friend Paulette Orr, who lived 2 streets over and had known Dorothy since both of their daughters were in the same first-grade class at Keswick Elementary, would later describe her in an interview as someone who made you feel, the moment you stepped into her house, that the world outside was manageable. Gerald Harlan left for the mill at 5:45 every weekday morning. Carol Ann took the school bus at 7:15. That September, Dorothy had been preserving the last of the garden before winter came for it. On the morning of the 14th, she had told Paulette by telephone the evening before that she planned to cut the roses in the morning, put up the last of the tomatoes, and meet her at Evelyn's for coffee at 10. She sounded, Paulette would later say, exactly like herself. That was the last conversation anyone outside of Alderman Road ever had with Dorothy Harlan. At 7:20 on the morning of September 14, 1968, Gerald Harlan had already been on the mill floor for more than 90 minutes. Carol Ann had boarded the school bus without incident. The roses were still in the garden. The garden shears were on the back step, where Dorothy always left them when she was about to go out. The coffee was still on the burner. By 9:15, Paulette Orr had tried the telephone twice and gotten no answer. By 10 o'clock, When Dorothy had not appeared at Evelyn's, Paulette drove to Alderman Road herself. The back door was unlocked. The coffee had burned down to nothing. The roses in the garden had been partially cut, 4 stems laid in the dirt beside the shear marks, and then left. The shears were gone. The car was in the driveway. Dorothy's coat was on the hook inside the door. Paulette called Gerald at the mill. Gerald called the Keswick police. By noon, Deputy Sheriff Roy Coulter had walked the property. He noted the cut roses. He noted the coat. He noted no sign of a struggle, no overturned furniture, no broken glass. He noted something else, too, something he recorded in the original case file, but that would not be fully appreciated for decades. A section of the garden at the far eastern edge, near the fence line, showed what he described as freshly disturbed earth, approximately 6 feet in length, as if recently turned. He assumed it was new planting. Dorothy gardened constantly. It was the kind of detail that, in a missing persons case in 1968 in a small Maine town, was easy to move past. Nobody moved back to it for 40 years. Gerald reported Dorothy missing. State police were notified by the following afternoon. A search of the surrounding woods, the riverbank, the stretch of Route 9 between Keswick and the neighboring town of Harlow, produced nothing. Nothing in Dorothy's life, no secret, no debt, no conflict that anyone knew of, suggested voluntary disappearance. She had not packed a bag. She had not touched the household savings. She had a daughter in 2nd grade who came home that afternoon and asked where her mother was. Nobody had an answer. The Keswick Police Department in 1968 consisted of a chief, 2 full-time deputies, and a part-time clerk. The Knox County Sheriff's Office took official lead on the investigation within the first week. The detective assigned was a 38-year-old named Dale Ingersoll, a methodical man who had grown up in a mill town himself and who took on the Harlan disappearance with what colleagues described as quiet personal investment. Ingersoll interviewed the neighborhood. He built a picture of the last 36 hours of Dorothy's visible life. He interviewed Gerald Harlan twice, then a 3rd time. Gerald's alibi, the mill, 40 witnesses, a foreman's sign and sheet, was airtight. He had never, by any account from neighbors or family, behaved toward Dorothy with anything other than concern and grief. Ingersoll eliminated him from suspicion within the first 2 weeks. A second name emerged more slowly. Vernon Atchley was 34 years old and lived 3 houses north on Alderman Road. He was unmarried, worked irregularly at a lumber yard in Harlow, and had, according to 2 neighbors, shown what one described as a particular interest in Dorothy Harlan, lingering near the fence when she gardened, appearing at the diner at the same time she did on mornings when her habits were predictable. Atchley submitted to a voluntary interview. He said he had seen Dorothy that morning, briefly across the fence line, sometime around 7:30. She had waved, he said. He had gone inside. That was his story in 1968. It never changed, and it could not be disproven. Ingersoll had no body. No physical evidence linking Atchley to a crime. No witness to a confrontation, a vehicle, a sound. Without a body, the case carried no formal criminal charge. The Knox County District Attorney reviewed the file in February 1969 and found insufficient cause for arrest. The case was classified as an open missing persons investigation and assigned to the lower shelf of a filing cabinet that was already full. Gerald Harlan put Carol Ann to bed every night for the next 6 years, telling her, for as long as he could make himself believe it, that her mother might still come home. The years have a way of covering things, not erasing them, but covering them the way the first snow of November covers a garden, changing the outline of everything without removing what's underneath. By 1975, 7 years had passed. Gerald Harlan had not moved from Alderman Road. He had not remarried. He kept a photograph of Dorothy on the mantel between the clock and the radio, and every September he put roses from her garden. She had planted them, and they kept coming back in a mason jar on the kitchen table, the way she always had. Carol Ann was 13. She had her mother's coloring and her father's quietness, and she had learned, as children in those circumstances do, to carry the absence the way you carry a stone in your shoe. You know it is there every step, but you have learned to walk. Vernon Atchley moved away from Alderman Road in 1972. He relocated to a rental property in Harlow, then drifted further, surfacing periodically in county records for minor citations, before disappearing from the visible record entirely by the early 1980s. The Keswick Police Department noted his change of address. Nobody followed him. By 1985, the house on Alderman Road was sold. Gerald had finally left. Carol Ann was grown. The new owners, a young family from Bangor, planted a vegetable garden in the backyard, adding raised beds along the eastern fence line without incident or ceremony. By 1990, they had expanded the garden further. They lived in the house for 11 years before selling it to a retired schoolteacher named Margaret Doucette, who kept the back plot as lawn. The case file moved with the office reorganizations of the 1970s, the computerization efforts of the late 1980s, and the archival consolidations of the 1990s, becoming, by the turn of the millennium, a manila folder in a metal cabinet in the Knox County Sheriff's Records Room, sitting between a 1971 vehicle theft and a 1969 civil dispute that had long since resolved itself. Dorothy Harlan's name was on the folder. Her photograph was inside. One person had never stopped looking. Dale Ingersoll had retired from the Knox County Sheriff's Office in 1994 after 30 years of service, with a commendation from the county commissioners and a box of personal files he had carried home and set in the corner of his garage. The box contained 4 unsolved cases from his career. One of them was Dorothy Harlan's. His daughter, who helped him pack his desk on his last day, said he had looked at the folder for a long time before he put it in the box. Some cases, he told her, don't let you be done with them. He was 73 years old and in poor health by 2005, but he was still writing letters. He wrote to the Knox County Sheriff's Office. He wrote to the Maine State Police Cold Case Unit, which had been formally established in 2003. He wrote to Carol Ann Harlan Prescott, who had moved to New Hampshire, married, and had children of her own. He told her he hadn't forgotten. She wrote back every time. Every case on this channel represents weeks of research, digging through records, verifying facts, and piecing together real lives that deserved better. If you want us to keep uncovering the truth behind stories like this one, please take a second to like this video and subscribe. Drop a comment and tell us where in the world you're watching from. Your support is what makes this possible. Now, let's get back to Dorothy. Then, in the spring of 2008, something happened that no one had anticipated. Detective Sergeant Lena Marchetti of the Maine State Police Cold Case Unit had been assigned a backlog review in February 2008, 37 open files from Knox and Waldo counties, ranging from the 1950s through the 1990s. Most were hopeless in the conventional sense. Insufficient evidence, witnesses deceased, no surviving physical material. She had been working through them in chronological order. The Harlan file came to her in March. She read it in an afternoon. She noticed what Dale Ingersoll had noticed 40 years earlier, the notation about freshly disturbed earth approximately 6 feet in length on the property's eastern fence line. She pulled the chain of title on the Alderman Road property. She noted that the current owner, Margaret Doucette, had maintained the eastern border of the property as open lawn for the last 9 years. She called Dale Ingersoll. He picked up on the second ring. "Mr. Ingersoll," she said, "I'm looking at the Harlan file. I want to talk about the garden." He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "I should have gone back to that in 1968. I've thought about it every year since. In April 2008, on a morning that was still cold enough to see your breath, Detective Marchetti obtained a warrant for non-invasive ground survey of the Alderman Road property. A forensic ground-penetrating radar team from the State Police Technical Services Unit ran a systematic sweep of the eastern border of the backyard. On the third pass, the equipment returned an anomaly. A dense, compact mass, irregular in shape, approximately 40 inches below grade. In a space that had not been structurally disturbed since the area was laid as lawn in the early 1990s. Ground-penetrating radar works by sending radio waves into the earth and measuring how they bounce back. Different densities, soil, rock, organic material, return different signatures. What the radar had found in the backyard of 14 Alderman Road was a density inconsistent with the surrounding soil composition. It was consistent with remains. Marchetti called her supervisor. She asked for an excavation warrant. He told her to run it again. She already had. The excavation of the eastern garden border at 14 Alderman Road, Keswick, Maine, was conducted over 3 days in late April 2008. The Knox County Medical Examiner's Office was present from the first day. By the afternoon of the second day, at a depth of 41 inches in the original eastern bed of what had once been Dorothy Harlan's kitchen garden, the remains of a woman were recovered. Dental records confirmed the identification on May 2, 2008. It was Dorothy Harlan. She had been there since September 1968. 40 years below the garden she had planted, in the earth she had tended, on the property where she had lived her ordinary, complete, unrepeatable life. The cause of death was determined by the medical examiner to be blunt force trauma. The manner of death was ruled homicide. Forensic analysis of materials recovered from the burial site, including trace fiber evidence, went to the Maine State Police Crime Laboratory. It was there that the case made its second critical turn. A single hair recovered from the burial site, preserved by the cold alkaline soil of the Maine ground, yielded viable DNA. That sample was entered into CODIS, the national DNA database maintained by the FBI, and cross-referenced against state and federal criminal records. The match came back on June 17, 2008. Vernon Atchley was 74 years old. He had been living under his own name in a trailer park outside of Brunswick, Maine for the past 11 years. He had 2 prior convictions in the 1980s, one for assault in Cumberland County and one for breaking and entering in Sagadahoc County, and both had required DNA collection under Maine's law. His profile was in the database. It had been waiting there for years. Detective Marchetti made the arrest call herself. 2 Knox County deputies and a Maine State Police detective drove to Brunswick on the morning of June 19, 2008. Vernon Atchley was sitting on his front step when they arrived. According to the arresting deputy's report, he looked at them and said nothing for a long time. Then he said, "I figured one day somebody'd find her." He had known she was there for 40 years. He had driven past the exit for Keswick every time he moved through that part of the state. He had known. He was arrested and charged with murder in the first degree. At a preliminary hearing in August 2008, his court-appointed attorney entered a not guilty plea. But the evidence was complete. The position of the burial site consistent with Atchley's known access to the property in 1968. the eyewitness account placing him at the fence line on the morning of the disappearance, and, following his arrest, a recorded phone call from the Knox County Correctional Center in which Ashley told his brother, the Dina, "Got me. Don't ask me anything else." The Knox County District Attorney entered the transcript into evidence. Vernon Ashley pleaded guilty to murder in the second degree in March 2009. He was sentenced to 25 years to life at the Maine State Prison in Warren. Given his age, the judge noted from the bench, the sentence was in practical terms a life sentence. The courtroom was silent when he was let out. Then someone began to cry, and it carried. Carol Ann Harlan Prescott was 64 years old in the spring of 2009 when she drove back to Knox County for the final hearing. She had not been back to Keswick in more than 20 years. She sat in the second row of the courtroom in a blue coat, her gray hair cut short, her hands folded in her lap, and she listened to every word of the proceeding without looking away from the bench. When it was over, she spoke briefly to Detective Marchetti outside the courthouse. "My father never stopped believing she was out there," she said. "He died in 2003. He never knew. I've thought a lot about whether that was mercy or just more loss." Dale Ingersoll died in October 2009, 5 months after the sentencing. He was 77. His family confirmed that he had been told about the arrest and conviction the previous year, and that he had been, his daughter said, as quiet and settled as I'd ever seen him. He had kept the Harlan folder in his garage for 15 years after retirement. At his death, his family donated it to the Knox County Sheriff's Historical Archive, where it sits now alongside the official case file. Dorothy Harlan was 41 years old in her best photograph, the one Carol Ann gave to the detective, the one that appeared in the press coverage of the 2008 arrest. She is standing in her garden on a summer morning, squinting a little into the light, wearing a blue house dress with the sleeves rolled to the elbow. She is holding a tomato she has just pulled from the vine. She looks like someone who is in the middle of her life. She was. The case of Dorothy Harlan changed one thing in Maine law. It contributed directly to the Knox County Sheriff's cold case protocols established in 2009, which mandated that all anomalous physical details noted at original scenes be formally flagged for re-examination in the event of future cold case review. The notation that Deputy Roy Coulter made in 1968, freshly disturbed earth, approximately 6 feet in length, is now cited in that protocol document as an example of the kind of observation that must never be allowed to pass unremarked. There is something worth sitting with in a case like this one. Not just the injustice of 40 years, though that is real and heavy. Something else. The idea that the truth was always there, in the ground, waiting, that the earth itself had kept what the justice system couldn't reach, that a single strand of preserved evidence, a notation in an old file, a detective who couldn't stop writing letters, and one investigator who read a case folder carefully on a cold afternoon in March, could together close the distance between 1968 and now. Justice can be slow. It can take decades and 2 generations and ground-penetrating radar to arrive. But it arrived for Dorothy Harlan on a spring morning in 2008, when the earth finally gave her back. We'd like to know what you think. Was the sentence Vernon Ashley received, 25 years to life at 74 years old, justice for what he did? Or does justice have a different meaning when it comes 4 decades late? What detail in this case stands out most to you? And why do you think the original 1968 investigation moved past that garden notation so quickly? And in a broader sense, how many other cases from this era do you think are waiting for the same combination of preserved evidence, modern technology, and one person who simply refused to give up? Justice found Dorothy Harlan after 40 years. Stories like hers are why this channel exists. If you believe truth is worth pursuing, no matter how long it takes, subscribe, and more cases are waiting in the description below. Thank you for being here.